Well, welcome, everyone. I am so glad to see people here for our discussion of the future of movie theaters, such as it may be. Maybe we'll figure that out. I can definitively say at the outset, to strike a tone, things are in flux. So I think maybe that's all we know for certain at the moment. The situation is in flux. I am David Sterritt, and I'm on the selection committee of WRIF, and I am very pleased and proud to be able to moderate this panel with James O'Hanlon and Sydney Stowe and Samantha Davidson Green. And maybe I'll ask each of you now to just introduce yourselves and say a bit about what you do and where you come from. You want to start, James?
Sure. James O'Hanlon. I am the current owner of the Savoy Theater in Montpelier, Vermont, and I've been told we're the only art house in Vermont, but I don't know if that's true. But I don't know how to find that out exactly. I know we're probably the only one for quite a ways around. I was working there. I had a friend who was the manager there for years, and I was out of the country for 2 years. Came back, didn't have anything going on, and he said, "Hey, do you want to be a projectionist at the Savoy?" And I said, "Absolutely, that'd be great," you know. And so within a couple of weeks of working there, I was like, "I love this place. It feels like home." Said to my friend, like, we should buy this place, and he turned white as a ghost and was just like, "Oh, I don't know if I would." And I was like, "Okay, it's fine." So I asked the owner, and he gave me some story about wanting to retire, and I'm thinking, like, this place makes no money. You're not going to retire on this, so I don't know what your plan is, but it's probably not going to work. And but either way, I let it go, and then 2 years later, things kind of fell into place, and I was off on a wild ride, and I'm coming up on my 6th year this September, and I've learned a ton, and we've somehow managed to weather the pandemic, and so I remain hopeful. The place seems to have a life of its own. I kind of view myself as more of the steward, and not like it's mine to kill or not kill. I don't feel like I have that role. I feel like it's my job to try to keep the place open if I can and do whatever I can. And so, to me, that means collaborating with other people, reaching out, asking other people what they do, what they know, what works, what doesn't work. Travis, who was instrumental in organizing this, was working with us and was very helpful too. And yeah, so I'll pass the mic on to Sydney here, who I just met.
Hi, I'm Sydney Stowe. I am the director of film at the Hopkins Center, which is Dartmouth College's Performing Arts Center, and probably the one-stop shopping in the Upper Valley for one of the multiple, actually, one-stop shopping, now that I think about Pentangle and Lebanon Opera House. I direct the public film exhibition program there, which means that we show movies in one-night bookings to the community, the campus, to the students, to anyone that wants to come. And we traditionally, before COVID, probably presented about 200 events a year, because we also, in addition to First Run and Art House, we would also play the Met HD series and the National Theater series, which has come back. So now, after COVID, we've got probably half that slate, and we charge admission, we run ads, so we really are a movie theater on a college campus, but it is open to everyone. And I got into the film business in LA and ended up moving here, followed a man, and found Bill Pence, who was my mentor for 19 years, and he was the previous director of the Hopkins Center Film Program and also the founder, one of the co-founders of the Telluride Film Festival, which is what explains why every year we are so lucky to be able to have the Telluride at Dartmouth program. And Bill retired in 2016, and I stayed on and was named director in 2018. And we were just talking shop about, because we are only a one-night house, we are a very different animal than your Regal or your Cinemark in terms of when we can play film. I see Laura in the audience, who has been my colleague and programmer for the last 9 months, and she has learned firsthand how being a one-night house is a very different animal than a regular movie theater. But I'm sure we're probably going to talk more about that, and I'm going to hand this over to Samantha Davidson Green.
It's humbling to be on stage with these three people, and great to have this conversation with all of you. I'm wearing two hats, one as an independent filmmaker and the other as a WRIF board member. And I joined the WRIF board in the fall of 2019, and started planning a festival for the spring of 2020, which never happened. So I don't really even know what it's like to be a part of a film festival organization in quote unquote normal times. But what I do appreciate about that experience is that I was distributing my first feature at the same time that I was trying to help lead with my colleagues at... Mic went out. How's that? Okay. I was trying to distribute my first feature at the same time that I was working with colleagues to try to navigate what film festivals might become during the pandemic. And the experience of my film, I had shot it in 2016, finished it in 2018, and premiered it at WRIF, actually in 2018, and then was on a festival circuit for a year with it, and then started distributing it also in the fall of 2019. So my little teeny tiny rowboat of a film got swept up in the tsunami of all the changes, some of which were very much underway already with movie theater, theatrical exhibition, but were just radically upended during the pandemic. So it's been the best and worst of times in some ways for both RIF and my film, but I'm looking forward to seeing what we can unpack about this.
Oh, all very, very interesting. Thank you all for those very eloquent self-introductions. It's funny, Sydney, you mentioned Bill Pence, and I knew Bill Pence for many a long year. I saw him mainly out at Telluride, actually, when I would go out there. And I'm not sure it was he who said what I'm about to quote, or paraphrase, I should say. I think it was. And this goes back like maybe to the maybe the 90s. And he said something about living in Hanover, New Hampshire, and every time there was like this new technological development would increase the number of movies he was able to see, which is to say, like cable TV came in, and then satellite TV came in, and I don't remember, and I'm not even sure it was Bill who said this, but it was somebody who lived up in this neck of the woods. And that, I think, is really important to all of this discussion. I mean, that was long before we started talking about pandemics or the future of movie theaters. But the idea that one of the things that these non-theatrical means of distribution have is they just increase the number of movies that are available to all of us, wherever we are. I mean, I lived in New York City for decades, and you know, I really looked at a lot of stuff that I wasn't seeing in a movie theater. So I think that's one of the advantages that those kinds of platforms give us. On the other hand, the pandemic has opened up this whole, obviously, new crop of horrors with people not wanting to go to movie theaters. Now, I just recently saw, somebody sent me this, somebody who interviewed me for an article out in Utah, actually. I mean, that's where the article was done. A survey done by Quorum, which is an outfit that keeps track of movie industry statistics and so forth. And they did just the end of last year, they did a survey of people, just moviegoers. Are you going to go back to movie theaters? Do you go to movie theaters now? And only 8% of the people said, no, I'm finished with movie theaters. Everybody else, some people were reluctant and said, I'm not sure I want to go, and other people were saying, oh yes, I still go, and you know, I wear my mask, and all, but only 8% were like really, really reluctant. I have found in the past couple of years that one of the best ways to social distance is to go to my local theater on a weekday afternoon. And I live within a few minutes' walk of a very good art theater in Baltimore, where I live now. And I am very often the only person in the auditorium, or one of 2 or 3 people in the auditorium. So this is fine for me because I don't have to worry about people answering their phones and whatnot during, you know, the high point of tension in the movie. But I really worry about the future of movie theater. So actually, I would like to ask you, James, a direct question here, which is, how does the future look for you? Obviously, nobody is sure about how things are going to go or turn out. But how is it now at this time when a lot of people are at least reluctant to go to the movie theater? And I wonder how that art theater I mentioned in Baltimore, and there's another, by the way, art theater very nearby, which is actually a nonprofit, how they stay in business. I assume they're maybe selling a lot of tickets on Saturday nights, but what's the secret?
I don't have a secret, but you know, there's a lot there, and really, to go back, you know, pre-lockdown there, pre you know, everything changing. My business, and I think the independent art house business, movie theaters maybe in general, the paradigm was shifting and we were in decline. And I've watched bookstores and record stores kind of go through the same thing, and they both had a bounce back period where you know, people decided, like, I don't want to just listen to MP3s, I want to actually own a vinyl record again, or I want to go to a bookstore, I don't want to read something on my phone. And so I've watched them both kind of have their renaissance, but they're different platforms. And, you know, without getting too lost in it, you know, the amount of content that's available now at any time, any place, is overwhelming. And so it's definitely been heading that way. The pandemic kind of pushed it into hyperdrive, because suddenly everybody was home. Netflix was you know, boomtown, and they're making tons of money because everybody's watching their content. I was going to use a different word, but I'll stick with content. Because I don't even watch Netflix anymore. Like, most of their shows don't interest me. They do kick out a good movie now and again, but other than that. But ultimately, even before this, I was looking at how do I survive? And there were a couple of things that came to mind. One is that I'm basically a community-based theater. And that's how my theater's managed to survive all this time, is support from the community, interest from the community, desire from the community for the place to be there. Now, at a point there, I thought, well, there's a lot of people who really want the theater to survive and will tell me that and send us money, but they aren't coming to the movies. So what's the point, right? If you can keep giving me money, if you're not going to come watch the films, it kind of doesn't make any sense. So what I try to do is program stuff that's going to have an interest to the community. We have a diverse community, but you know, things that will have an appeal, and try to get somebody to come speak, introduce the film, have a panel discussion. And so I was kind of ramping up to have roughly 2 events like that a month at my theater just prior to the lockdown there. Other things, festivals, those kind of things, I think are what kind of that diversify the programming, kind of more like what you know, Sydney's venue does, or the Catamount Arts Center does, where you've got you know, it's not just movies, because I can't depend on just, you know, the next movie to come out to like bring in a crowd again. The other thing I'm looking at is I've got to have a younger audience that's taking an interest here. The older demographic, that people like myself and older than myself, we grew up going to the movies. That was what we did, and it was unique, and it was exciting, and you'd get ready for the film. And I remember living in San Francisco, and I'd read up on these films, and I'd go see them, and it was a big part of my life. You know, film was a huge part of my life, and it was what informed my thinking and how I live my life. That's changed now. You know, people are getting what they want from so many different places, and so it's got to be a fairly unique film to get the kind of crowds out that would enable us to survive on just films alone. So I feel like I've gone on and on a lot, but those are the things that I'm looking at when I think about, like, how do I move forward? How do I survive?
Very interesting. And Sydney, I'd like to know one question, like, what sort of fare do you program, and what tends to do well and what tends to do not so well?
Before COVID, we joked we would play the best of everything we could get in that 10-week term, because we program on the academic calendar. And it was Batman to, you know, the Norwegian thriller Breaking Surface, to a documentary about, you know, chemistry. I mean, we played everything. Since COVID, we've said that probably the same thing. The audience, our audience, has not come back at the level it should have. I mean, Belfast, to give you an example, we played it in, like, right in the Oscar, like in the sweetest spot we could play. We would have had 2 sold-out shows. We would have had 450 people for that, and we had 162. Wow. But you could see it at home for $20. Yeah. So for me, the power of the cinema has shifted finally away from theaters, who used to have exclusive windows. I mean, movie theaters could play a movie, be dirty, be expensive. You had no choice. There was a 45 to a 90-day window for years. And then in 2020, when Universal released Trolls at home and in a theater, was the beginning of the shift. And then, you know, we know Warner Brothers and HBO Max. So the challenge now is that people don't have to leave their house. So we have to figure out how to get to them and what will they come out for. And my friend said, well, I watched Belfast at home. I mean, for $20, which I think is incomprehensible to pay for a home movie, that's at least what 2 of them would pay going to the movie. And then she didn't have to face going into a theater. And our age is the age that doesn't want to go in. The younger people are coming out, and that's why horror has jumped. Because that horror has made a whole genre jump if you see what's coming out, it's because younger people are like, no problem. And our numbers at Dartmouth, our student numbers went up through the roof because they're not afraid to come in. Now, I'm hoping that it'll come back, so when we're looking to program, Laura and I are also being like, wow, this would have been a surefire hit, and we get 40 people. Yeah. So it's hard to know what will, but No Time to Die, 230, we sold that show out. So I wish I had a better answer for you, because the stuff that I think people are dying to see, like The Duke, would have been a home run before. I mean, Jim Broadbent, comedy, the British, love them, and it's not doing any business. Yeah. And it played at the Nugget, but it's not, we always play after the Nugget. And so I would love to say that I've got the secret. I think what you were saying about we're going to do more events, more talks. I would love to be able to serve beer and wine. I think I've been told that's a pipe dream. But I think it's important because we're not competing. In a given evening, we make the decision, are we going to stay home or are we going to go out? And so if we're going to go out, are we going to go to a club? Are we going to go to a restaurant? Are we going to go to a show? Are we going to go to a movie? And so we need to be on par with the other options that are offered out. Yeah. Because if you want to stay home, it doesn't matter what's playing out in the theater. You just want to stay home. Right. So I don't think the proliferation so much of content is impacting people going. We just need to get those people who feel like having a night on the town. We need to be able to compete with the other options. And we're still trying to navigate that within the constraints of the college.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I would like to ask you another question, Samantha, and that is, I mean, back before the pandemic, and even before like all the streaming options that we have nowadays, when there were just like even VHS video cassettes, things like that. The conventional wisdom, and I'm sure it was correct, is that even if you expected the bulk of your sales, if you were like an independent film or something, to be ultimately in home video, having some sort of theatrical opening was really important to sort of get the ball rolling. What would be your ideal way to launch an independent film that you have? One little sub-question, you never gave the title of your film before, and never lose an opportunity to get the title out there.
Thank you, David. My film is called Thrasher Road, and it's available on all the platforms. Thank you. I appreciate the question. When I was preparing to make a first feature, and it was a small personal feature that I hoped would help open the door to doing more work. I was really coming out of a model that came from, I too was in San Francisco in the 90s going to a lot of art house films, and the theatrical experience was sort of a sacred ritual for me. And as a filmmaker, I mean, I'm just old enough to really remember going to the Nugget and the Hop as a kid in the 70s and 80s, and the sound of the click, click, click of the projector. And I have that nostalgia. There's a whole aesthetic that is inspirational as an artist when you're envisioning the final moment that you share your film with an audience in the room. And the social aspect of theatrical viewing is part of that. So my answer to your question starts with actually what comes before the release, which is the festival, the role of the festival for the independent filmmaker, because I was also kind of that generation coming up at Sundance, was an intern there while I was in film school, and we had a very deliberate festival strategy for my film. My producers had a sort of A, B, C tiers, and we timed our submissions, and the idea was that the festival run would help you get to a theatrical release. And even if it's only a week, I mean, we had all sort of adjusted down to like, you try to play for a week in New York or LA just so you might have some awards. I knew that my film was never gonna be, picked up by a major distributor, but it still was seen as an important, that theatrical piece, and I didn't expect to have like a 45 or 90 day, exclusive theatrical, but to have, at least a week or two in a theater. And then, there's the, like, parallel to publishing, there's the self-publishing question, like, do you pay to put it into theatrical for a week? Sometimes you do that in order to attract critics who, in the hope that as a first-time filmmaker, somebody will recognize something of quality in your work and take an interest and tell a story that will be meaningful. And you're trying to just build as much momentum and awareness, with the added layers of using social media and everything else. So much work has come back on the individual filmmaker in this tier that really is a crushing amount of work. I mean, when you have to also be writing it and directing actors and involved in it, and the business piece of it was not one that I felt very well equipped for coming out of film school. I went to UCLA and I finished in 2005. So I shot my thesis film on 35 millimeter and actually made a print, which I had the chance to show once at Dartmouth. And that was through a grant from Kodak, and that was a sort of a last-ditch effort by Kodak and Fuji to entice people coming out of film schools in LA to use film, and that still has cachet, but there's, the question of why, every choice you're making along the way is in some ways tied to some hope or expectation about that, theatrical experience. And what happened for us was we did have 1 week at a theater in LA in the fall of 2019, but we also started streaming simultaneously. And I ended up choosing to work with a distribution collaborative in LA. I sort of had like two interests in picking up the film, and one distributor was quite opaque about what they were going to do with the film, and I had did some due diligence and heard from other filmmakers that they were not forthcoming about how the film was doing, and they wouldn't give you a lot of numbers to try to have agency as a filmmaker to help boost whatever audience you could. Whereas the other was this very pro-independent filmmaker group that has a very interesting model, pretty democratic and transparent. On a quarterly basis, I get a report of how the 700 films or so in the stable are doing, but it all assumes post-theatrical. It's all these different streaming platforms. And one of the big things that has come home for me in the last 3 years is, well, for one thing, I cherish the film festival experience even more, but in a different way. I'm always asking with our board, what are we doing for filmmakers? Because I think that's a really important thing, but not necessarily because we're going to help them clear some hurdle to get, a theatrical or other distribution deal, but just artistically to help them do their best work, build a network, and to join us in this conversation about learning this vastly, rapidly changing business landscape, so they might have a chance of adapting and finding a career path. But the other part that I've learned is that we're in a bit of a bubble here. Our film festival, academic community, art house theater assumes a certain, even the Netflix subscribers. I mean, they're now opening up to ad-driven options. And what I've learned is that my film is doing best in an AdVOD, the advertising video on demand space, Tubi, and that there are just millions and millions of Americans who are interested in diverse content who aren't necessarily participating in the kind of channels that I had been a part of. And I have mixed feelings about this explosion of content because I really appreciate the curation. I mean, at the end of the day, it's overwhelming. But being that independent filmmaker, I'm sort of on both sides of that gate, and I'm also not wanting to miss the little gems that might be, not getting the attention of the curators. So I'm trying to be optimistic about it, and just take an attitude of adaptation to these new forms.
It's interesting that as digital media had their great rise, and more films were being shot on video, and certainly in most movie theaters now movies are being projected on video and so forth, there was a lot of talk about the democratization that would result from this, and how it was now really inexpensive to make a movie. Basically, you just needed a camera and and a laptop, and you could do it. But then the question immediately that you came up, who's going to sort through all of this stuff, and tell me what's actually worth my time? And of course, that's where critics become really important, assuming that they have any taste at all. But it's another kind of a challenge, I think, that's opened up because there is so much, to use that word again, content. Not my favorite word, but yeah, it suffices in some cases. I mean, that's so interesting, all the things that you just said. And another thing that comes, I mean, you emphasize the festival experience. And like, I think a lot of people, they sort of read about festivals once in a while, or they see headlines about festivals, don't realize how important. And that's really a fairly modern phenomenon. I mean, film festivals go back, many, many, many decades. But the idea of they're playing in a really important part in what gets to people just everywhere, because it's where so many films are launched nowadays. I know when I was a regular newspaper or movie critic, I spent an enormous amount of time going to festivals and seeing whatever I could. And there are all kinds of different festivals, and they show different kinds of things. But one of their big functions is to launch things. And I was always kind of explaining to my editors, why do you want to write about this festival in Europe or this festival in the middle of Colorado or something? Because this is where movies are beginning their careers, and they will soon be available to people all over the place. Do you pay much attention to what goes on in the festival circuit?
I have a film booker, so I was talking to Sydney about that. She books her own films, and I've kind of toyed with that idea of like booking my own films, which is just to break that down. I can do it, but I'm lazy, and I don't like dealing with like the big corporate distributors like Warner and Universal. So I don't mind paying a guy $300 a month to talk to them for me. But he goes to the festivals, or he used to. I don't know if he's gone in the last 2 years. Toronto is where these big films are going to be birthed, and they're going to get attention and that sort of thing. And then the smaller festivals are where other films come. So me personally, I do not pay that much attention to them. I like to have my staff involved too. They watch a lot of trailers. I watch a lot of trailers. Something catches our eye, we get excited about it. But what I have developed is basically a screening process where I read a lot of reviews, I watch the trailer, I look at sort of like what kind of broad appeal a film might have, and then I listen to my film booker, who's like, this is a film you should play right now. I'm like, okay, whatever. So we have a lot of back and forth around that. But no, I personally don't pay a lot of attention to the festivals because I have other people who are my eyes and ears out there, and I've got a lot of other stuff that I do pay attention to. So.
Are you a theatrical run? You do week-long bookings?
Yeah.
How about you, Sydney? What do you?
Well, we are one night, which means that we have the benefit. We're like the last kid picked. We can sit back and see how a film has done in a local theater, and when we look at films, we look at sometimes if we've never heard of the film, we look at the festivals it played at. We also have a series of distributors that we trust. So if it's a zeitgeist film, I already know it's going to be good. But we'll look and see, like if it's a documentary, if it played at Full Frame, I know that's a really high-end documentary festival. So I do look at what they're playing. I read, I watch. The great thing about being virtual is I could watch probably half a dozen films at a Sundance, which even though I know I can't play right away, I also now know I've seen them. And then I can sort of track them and see who's going to get them. But we really, like I said, because we're only one night, we cannot. So, for example, Top Gun opened last night. I actually saw it Thursday night, but it opened last night. We won't get that film till maybe July. So it gives me the patience to sit and be like, oh, wow, that movie bombed? Or, wow, look at how well that one's doing. So I look like a genius, but honestly, I just get to follow. I get to kind of sweep in. And we used to joke we were the last train before video, which is one of the reasons I think we were so successful, is if you didn't make it to the theater in time to see Lincoln, the Hop was going to play it. That is no longer the case. But so we had the enormous advantage of just being able to sit still and wait and kind of swoop them up in a net. Now that the release dates, the theatrical windows are so short, and their talk now, the standard has now gone back to, if it's a big film, they're going to give theaters 45-day exclusive. So at least that, which is good, because I do think that if you could stay home and watch the movie and you see we're playing it, you might be like, oh, I'm going to do something else tonight. I'll watch it on Sunday. So I'm grateful that it looks like the theatrical window, which gives theaters the exclusivity, is going to come back. It shrank during the pandemic. And unfortunately, all the major studios have their own streaming arms now. But they've agreed that most of them, Disney is the only one who's like, you're going to go out to theaters and you're going to go right on video. But the rest are still trying to honor that window. Because I talked to a friend of mine at A24, and she said, there is no revenue like theatrical film revenue. In addition to getting the film around the world and building up the name and the momentum, and movie stars are built on the screen, not in the stream, but the theatrical box office is where studios make their money back. It is not in streaming, because they have to pay a lump sum to the streamer, and they have no idea how that movie did. So when they sold Mitchell and the Machines, which is a Dartmouth alums animation film, to Sony, Sony sold it to Netflix. That's a $500 sale. They'll never know how that film did for Netflix. So I think that for theaters need to stay alive and do a better job of getting people in, because we are still the best delivery method for the studios. And I pray that continues.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we're out of business.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, it is so interesting. I mean, one little footnote here about the festivals launching movies. I just got done writing a pretty long review essay of a fairly early Coen Brothers movie, Miller's Crossing, for a film magazine. And I was reminded when I was writing that Miller's Crossing played at the New York Film Festival when I was on the selection committee there. And I can remember very well it being selected, and I was all for that. And then it was decided we'll make it the opening night film. And I said, I don't think it's quite good enough to be the opening night film, which is a very special deal. But no, I was totally outvoted by everybody else. So that's fine. So it opened the festival, and people didn't like it. It opened in theaters the next day, and people didn't go. And it lost $1 jillion. And it didn't cost $1 jillion to make, so that's obviously a total exaggeration. But I'm just saying the idea that, that a really prestigious festival, and then it goes directly into movie theater, is going to, automatically make for success. I just don't think that has ever automatically been the case. That said, festivals do remain an enormously important launching pad for so many movies, especially independent movies. So that's just one thing I wanted to sort of throw in there. But I'm reminded of one more thing now, to talk a little bit about the difference between experiencing films in these different venues. When was it? Several months ago, maybe? I don't think it was a year, when Denis Villeneuve's movie of Dune came out. And of course, he was very vocally and publicly furious that the studio decided to release it simultaneously, theatrically and streaming. And Villeneuve said, no, my film demands to be seen, in the big theater. And one of the reasons that struck me is that one of my interviews with David Lynch was when he made his movie of Dune back in 1984. And I remember very specifically him making a big point. This film has got to be seen now in movie theaters, and not just in movie theaters, but in good movie theaters. This movie has to have a great big screen, and it has a really excellent surround sound, Dolby system, and all that. Otherwise, you're not really seeing my movie, he said. Well, first of all, only some movie theaters have the kind of thing. And by the way, since it is widely agreed, I think too much agreed, that David Lynch's Dune is not a good movie. I think it's not bad. I think it holds up quite well against the Denis Villeneuve Dune, actually. That's another story. But he maybe was overcompensating for that. Like maybe I know. In fact, he himself has said in more recent years that he's not very fond of that movie himself, which he made. But maybe he was saying it has to be seen in the right. If you go and see it in the wrong movie theater, it's not my fault if you don't like it. It's your fault because you saw it in the wrong movie. I think there was a little subtext of that going on. Anyway, the point I'm making is that there have always been strong feeling. And by the way, even at that time, even when David Lynch said that to me, I was thinking, in the secret recesses of my mind, we live now in the age of like video cassette. And most people, let's face it, over the years are going to see this movie on video cassettes. And of course now we know DVDs and Blu-rays and streaming and all of that. But no matter how successful a movie is when it comes out in theaters, if it is a movie that people really want to see, it will have an afterlife of years and decades where people will not be seeing it for the most part in movie theaters. So I think that's sort of worth keeping in mind, kind of like that. So I just like any further thoughts that any of you might have about the differences between just the quality of the movie experience, aside from the presence of the audience. When you see something in a good movie theater, let's say an adequate movie theater, or when you see it at home on whatever system you happen to have. Oh, I've stumped the panel.
Tom Cruise opens Top Gun Maverick with a personal message, and he said, "This film is only available in theaters right now, and this is the place to see this film." He actually addresses it. I mean, the bummer is that, you know, there's only a handful of directors in the business that can require theatrical release only. It really comes down to the studio they work with, unfortunately. So it would be great if they could say, I want my film only on a theater for 90 days, and then you can put it out. But I don't know how much power the director has to claim the plan. You know, Telluride always believes that we were raised sitting around a campfire telling stories, and that is what movies give us. We collectively meet in the dark, and we experience something together. I think we all know this because of how old we are. I live with 3 teenagers who I don't think understand that concept. Well, they would be mortified. There's 22, 21, and 17. And I don't know whether it's because they haven't seen the right movie in a theater or they have on-demand content now. One of them watched Game of Thrones on his phone yesterday. And so I think they just have a different parameter. So I am a little nervous about the next generation coming up and not flocking to a theater. For why I'm grateful that Batman and Strange have done such huge business, because those are events and they are getting people to the theater. The big question is, and I think one of the theater chains calls them masks and capes. Will anyone go to the non-superhero films? And that's why I think Maverick is such an interesting question, because that's not a franchise. I mean, not a technical franchise, which are the only ones that have really made any money. So I'm hopeful that with Spider-Man and Strange have made a ton of, and Batman have all made a ton of money this year. But I'm hopeful that if the studios continue to give great product and movie theaters do a better job of giving a better experience, I'm hopeful that we can reverse that trend and introduce another generation to what it's like to sit in a theater and watch a movie. And that's my hope.
Can I jump in? Because our teenagers overlap. Little, and it's interesting because I relate to what you're saying, Sydney, but I also see things a little bit differently in terms of the teenagers in our house, in that for one thing, I think the pandemic hit this generation at a time when, for the teens and young adults, they lost the option for a little while. But also, as you're observing at Dartmouth, they are racing back in sooner than the older audiences. And I think the social experience does mean something. I mean, for our kids to go up to Hanover and go to the Nugget with their buddies, it's a night out and it is an event, and they really enjoy that. So I'm sort of hopeful about that. I also think that the campfire, which I love, and I share that sort of vision of what we do as filmmakers, is we have lots of little campfires, because this is how a lot of kids share. And I mean, if you look at them together, they'll hover together over somebody's phone, but also the nature of how word of mouth spreads among kids and their relationship to movies, the amount of trailer watching that they do, and the whole way, we don't have stars in the Tom Cruise model exactly, but they have a different kind of relationship with celebrities because they follow them, and they even have opportunities sometimes to have interaction with them through these channels. So I think, the other thing I wanted to respond to is, we think about this at WRIF. I mean, we worked to get a new projector in the last year. We have a better projector. We're working, CATV is a sponsor of this film festival, and we've been working on this space to improve our audio. We'd love to get 5.1. But the truth of the matter is that you drop out of that top tier of theaters. And, you know, as a filmmaker, I've been to festivals and I've seen my film, Nora, I'm sure you can relate, you know, exhibited so badly that, you know, it's like the range of what happens to your film in theaters and festivals, you surrender a lot of control over that aesthetic experience for the audience when you're not one of the few directors in the studio system who has the power to kind of dictate that high level. So I do think I like the accountability that theaters have been called to during the pandemic to say, you got to improve your systems, you got to clean up the sticky seats, West Lebanon, and make it like a nice place, make it worth going out to. And I know our kids are paying attention to that. And I think the social thing for them of being able to go out with their friends, that's the formative experience like we had. You know, you have at different early stages of your life that I think will continue to bond kids to the theatrical experience. I mean, it is a bummer that it is all these big, expensive franchise films that are playing in the theaters.
But if it gets them in there.
If it gets them in there, I just hope that, you know, I feel like there's a wide range of character-driven, interesting material that really formed my worldview as a kid and teenager that I would also go to with my parents, and we would have interesting conversations about it. And, you know, I'm not having as much, conversation about the Marvel films because I'm just kind of bored with them after a while. But, you know, if the kids are enjoying them, it's getting them there. That's good. You know, the pandemic has made me grateful for anything.
Yeah, it's funny. A friend of mine just recently sent around a little item from somewhere or other about, I can't remember who it was. Somebody was commenting on going to one of the big superhero franchise films and being surrounded by somebody who, it was Anthony Lane at the New Yorker. And Anthony said something about going to see whatever one of the latest ones was. And he was surrounded by all of these young people, and they were all having a great time. But what seemed to please them the most was when characters from other franchise movies would come into this. And he said he realized he was in the middle of a sort of a religious service here. Absolutely. And he wasn't familiar with the liturgy, and it didn't really speak to him, but he could see that it really meant a lot to these people here, and they really understood a lot about it that he was not understanding. And I can get pretty, sometimes just upset with the theatrical experience. One little example, Spike Lee, when he made Black Klansman, which I think is a terrific movie, and it has this incredibly somber ending with the American flag full screen upside down, and it's warning us all about the future. And seeing it at my local art theater in Baltimore, somebody behind me, her phone rang, and she started discussing where they were going to pick her up. And since there were only that woman and me and about 3 other people in that afternoon showing, it was rather disturbing. So that's the worst thing that can happen. However, many, many decades ago, I had a great learning experience as a movie critic when I went to a preview screening, a press screening, except it was one of these where they invite a whole lot of locals and give out free tickets. And it was a movie with Bill Cosby and Sidney Poitier, and it was aimed primarily at black audiences, which is not me. And they filled the theater with black people, mostly, primarily. And there were, me and some other critics. And I learned so much from that experience. People were really, it was a comedy, were uproarious at things that I might not have noticed. But the very second they cued me in by their delight, I got it. And I had such a great experience at that screening with a movie that otherwise would have gone largely over my head, just because it was not aimed at my demographic, and because, I guess I was just I was very young then. I've learned so much in the years since. But anyway, so there are times when that experience of the audience can be not so good, like the woman answering her phone, but there can be times when it can really, really be quite marvelous. Do you get to experience that as a theater proprietor?
Well, I mean, I watch movies in my own theater, so I do sit with the crowd sometimes. And so to speak to some of the other stuff that's been said here, the younger demographic, I am seeing more of it. The stuff they come out for is typically kind of got this tinged with horror, which I'm not a huge fan of horror. And in fact, I've watched a lot of these films and I'm just like, okay. Like I just watched Men, and I love the first hour plus, and then it goes into, if you haven't seen the film, I won't spoil it, but there's 20 minutes in there of just like body horror or whatever. And I was just like, really? Like, this, Midsummer had the same kind of reaction too. But like David was saying, a lot of these younger people are seeing things in these films that I'm not necessarily picking up. Mm-hmm. So I'm not going to not show them, because I want to bring that demographic in. There is a social aspect. Sometimes they come alone, but typically they're coming with friends. They want to talk about it. It's speaking to them on a level that it's not necessarily speaking to me on. That's fine. And another thing, really we've talked, like a couple people here have talked about it, and really what we're doing is we're showing stories. And as an art house proprietor, I'm not going to show Top Gun. I'm not going to show any superhero Marvel films. I'm not going to go see them. I have zero interest in them. I don't find any story there. A lot of young people do. They find stories within the characters and whatever. I'm not finding any story there. But what I am seeing is that with this explosion of content, with this sort of, I don't know if I'd call it the democratization of filmmaking, but there's definitely new voices coming out, and we need to hear these new stories, because I felt like for a long time we've heard the same stories for so long. To speak about the theatrical experience itself, before I started working at the theater and subsequently became the owner, I had stopped going to the movies, and I was watching, movies on like little crappy discs and whatever, and some voice in my head said, cinema's dead. There's no good movies being made anymore. There's nothing really interesting. And I think part of that was the medium I was experiencing it on, and also where I was getting it. It was kind of piecemeal. I was like scanning Netflix or looking for a cheap DVD to watch and that kind of thing. And I remember when I first started working at the theater, and we had this film called Tracks, which is an Australian film. Somebody here has actually seen it and heard of it. I sat in the theater and watched it, and I was completely moved in a way that I hadn't been moved for a long time. And it brought home to me why that theatrical experience can be so powerful. I would not probably have been moved necessarily watching it on a laptop with headphones in the same way. So that to me informs that there is still something special about it. And then I'll just say this other thing, which is that I just recently watched this interview with the director at Cannes, who was talking about essentially the commodification of culture and art. And when we reduce film to only films that are going to make money, we are selling ourselves short, we're selling our culture short, and we're cutting out a lot of the voices and stories that otherwise could be heard. And so one of the blessings of the pandemic for a theater like mine is that I've been given this government money. It's about to run out, probably in 3 months. But it has allowed me to show films that normally before I wouldn't have shown, because I'd say, I can't afford to show that film. Well, when nobody was coming anyway, I said, screw it, I'm going to show the films I want to show. And I'll show films that hopefully will make money too. And I'll tell you what, it was not as out of balance as one might think. Like Sydney was saying, like with Belfast. There's a film that's supposed to knock it out of the park. It didn't really do that much. I've shown other small art house films that nobody's heard of that have done actually pretty good. So I'm going to keep doing that, because one, I didn't buy this business to show crap that I don't want to see, and I bought it because I believe in cinema, and I believe in cinema as a valid art form and a way to tell stories and a way for people to come together and have a cultural experience together. So I want to be able to offer these, and I want people to have access to them, just like I had access to them growing up and living in New York and living in San Francisco, when I could go see these films that essentially changed my life.
Yeah, no, very, very, very well put.
Yes.
The other thing is that there's always the danger that lurks in the back of my mind that there are young people, especially nowadays, who are watching Lawrence of Arabia on their iPhones. This is something
That's still a good thing.
Yeah, it's true. They're watching it at all.
Well, at least they're seeing Lawrence of Arabia, I suppose, in some form. But anyway, that's not how you're supposed to see that kind of movie. It somehow isn't right. Then again, this is a funny thing too, because and it gets back to the pros and cons of the theatrical experience. A friend of mine named Godfrey Cheshire, who's a movie critic and is an authority on Iranian film, a few years ago, hosted a screening of a very great Iranian film, Taste of Cherry by Abbas Kiarostami, at a theater right near where I live, and not a theater, a museum, the Walters Art Museum, right near where I live in Baltimore. And they advertise this a lot, and they said, 35 millimeter projection, come see see it the way it's meant to be seen. So I went and I saw it, and Godfrey introduced it, and it was very, very nice, except for one thing. The print they were showing was scratched, faded, spliced, and awful. And if they had just put a halfway decent DVD in their projector, it would have looked 1,000,000 times better. So, it has to be done right, even, in a sort of a that was a museum. But, they have a little theater in the museum. And anyway, it has to be done right. But anyway, so there are always these pros and cons and different ways of looking at these things. Do you think that the future, here's my personal guess as to what the future holds. I think that we are looking toward a future that is going to be sort of hybrid. That there are still going to be movie theaters, but there is also going to be a great deal of streaming material, and that a lot of people are going to be seeing movies in both venues. My guess is more people will be seeing more movies streaming in some form like that, streaming, Blu-rays, something, than in theaters. But I think theaters are going to stay around. I think they're going to, one thing that you made me think of, James, was, something somebody said many years ago that stuck in my mind. Young people always want a reason to get out of the house. So, if for no other reason, and then if you're going to show good movies, once they're out of the house and they're in that theater, they're going to see something that's maybe going to improve their lives a little bit. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a good thing. But that's my guess. There's going to be sort of a hybrid future. There are people who feel that the theatrical experience is going to dwindle and not be around much anymore. Another thing which I have often quoted, I heard this years ago, I can't remember who said it, and I'm not saying this myself, but I think there's just enough of a germ of truth in it to make it worth repeating every now and then. Somebody said that in the future, going to the movies is sort of going to be like going to the opera is now, which is to say, you won't do it very often. Many people will never do it at all. And when you do it, you'll maybe put on your good shirt, and your nice pair of trousers, and you'll make an evening of it, and it'll be kind of a special thing. So that's another possibility for the future. But I don't think things are going to go quite that bad for movie theaters and, theatrical, any kind of, public venue for seeing a movie with other people. But I'm just wondering, my guess is it's going to be a hybrid future where streaming will sort of dominate. What do you folks think?
I would say I agree. Yeah. I look, when I was teaching film at Dartmouth, and, I'd always kind of start with the origins of film and the hysteria, as film became ascendant, this degraded form of entertainment relative to opera or live theater. These things have a way of just, evolving and kind of becoming a part of an ecosystem. Streaming is something we couldn't really imagine 20 or 25 years ago. Now it's so natural, and we lead such mediated lives where there's such an integration that it won't go away. And frankly, I'm glad, because I've had some wonderful film experiences with the kids during the pandemic. We project at home. We innovated with WRIF last year and did expanded cinema outside, and we were projecting on buildings, just, trying to find creative ways to use the moving image as an art form to bring people together. Imagine the campfire moving in different places. But I love the liturgy, the sacred ritual of the theater experience. I don't think it'll go away altogether, because I think it's a form we are finessing to really kind of a peak opportunity when it's done well.
So there is a vote of confidence in the future. What do you say, Sydney?
Well, I think about when... did I lose my... Okay. I think we are social animals. And a friend of mine who's a consultant said, when this pandemic ends, it's going to be like the Roaring 20s. People are going to go back, and there'll be dance halls, and there'll be restaurants will be teeming, and we already know, 87% pre-pandemic for open tables. So people are going back to restaurants. People are flying. Because I was joking, being a film theater in a pandemic is like being a travel agent or maybe a yoga studio. But I think that people like being together. Even if you go alone, you're still in a room with 3 other people. So you can go alone to a theater, or you can go in as a group. So I really hope, I think fundamentally, sometimes you just want to be You want to surrender, and you want to be where energy is. And that's why sometimes I think people are just like, well, I just want to go to a movie, and I'll pick one when I get there. But I really just want to go and give myself over to an experience where I don't have my phone, I can just give it. So my hope is that theaters get better, we get smarter about keeping our patrons and building new ones, and I don't think it'll be quite the opera. I'm hoping it'll be more prevalent than that. But I watch stuff at home. But I choose the stuff I want to watch at home. And I know still the difference between the experience. And I'm hoping that, as you said, when the kids are coming up and want to go out for the night, we will have something there to get them in. And maybe they see a trailer in front of Taste of Cherry, in front of Batman. And, so I have great hope that people will still, because that's a great programming choice. But I hope that people, I would like to believe, because I'm social, I like to believe that it's still one of the greatest, even after all these years of working there, when those lights go down, it is so exciting, because I'm like, oh my God, you guys are going to be so excited to see this. Like, it's a thrill. It's probably why you do it. It's a thrill to put on a movie and know that an entire group of strangers is going to be transported for 2 hours. And that's why I can't believe they pay me to do my job. So I'm bullish, but also acknowledging that I won't even talk about my monthly fees for streaming, because I think there's going to, hopefully, if we get a better schedule and a more robust release slate, we will have more choices. We'll have more come-ons back out in the audience in the release again, because we haven't seen one yet where those great small films will be back out, Sony Classics and Magnolia, and then we'll be able to see where we land. But I still believe in going to the movies.
Excellent. And James, you want to bat cleanup for us here? We're just about out of time.
Yeah, absolutely. I talked a lot already, so I didn't want to let other people have. I had a thought about something you just said, but now I'm blanking. So my little town, Montpelier, there's 8,000 people in Montpelier, and we have 2 movie theaters. And so I'm actually competing with this 5-screen house. Now they've gone to 4 nights a week, and I'm open 7 again. I sometimes have gone to that theater to watch a film. We're showing different things for the most part. Occasionally we overlap, but I don't know what happens to them. I think that the 2 different models are going to have different trajectories. That's my feeling. Art houses are going to go one direction, and these big houses are going to go in another. I think there's always going to be an audience and a desire for these kind of big spectacle films. My sort of appetite for that has waned as I've gotten older, and also as I've found the stories have become pretty vapid. But that's me, and younger people will go see those films. A lot of people enjoy those films, and I think there'll always be an appetite for that. I don't know what their model looks like going forward, but I also don't have to concern myself with that. For art houses, I think, for me personally, and for art houses in general to survive, I think we have to become more community-oriented and diversify our content, because we're not going to see the kind of huge audiences that those films get for any of the films we show. I think those days are behind us. The last time I saw any big numbers was La La Land, which I somehow managed to snatch from that other theater, which was a total coup, and has not happened since, because it took me forever to pay it off, and I don't think the distributor likes us anymore. But either way, just the amount of people that came out for that film, I haven't seen that since for any film. Summer of Soul was great last year. We've had some good films, whatever. The other thing, when I was living in San Francisco, I'd go out with friends. We'd go to the second-run houses. And I remember my film booker now, he always said, you don't want to be a sub-run house. And I always thought, why don't I want to be a sub-run house? Great movies come out. They come and go in the blink of an eye. If you didn't hear about it, maybe you missed it. And then later, they develop a following. Not everything that I watch, I feel like, has to be seen on a screen. But there are some films, like Lawrence of Arabia. I'm not going to watch that at home. I'm going to watch it on a screen, because it's a totally different experience. And so I feel like when I look at the ideal model for an art house theater like mine going forward, it's a mix. It's a mix of second-run films. It's a mix of older films. It's a mix of events, maybe music. maybe comedy. I have a perfect comedy space downstairs. Those are the things that kind of keep my theater going without getting too far out there. I'm not going to start selling tacos in the basement, but we'll keep it cinematically oriented. But I feel like it's got to be more diverse. I'm not going to be ever dependent on these big blockbusters to pay my rent, even though they will pay my rent in a lot of ways. But I've got to have a diversity there. I think that's the only way I survive.
Hear, hear. I think we have time if there are any questions that you in the audience would like to ask.
I can run a microphone. Unless you, yeah.
No, I was just getting it for you.
Oh, thanks.
Yes, ma'am.
So Sydney touched on it a little bit, but when we're talking about bringing the young crowds in, and obviously, to get them out, you're trying to give them a night out, right? And you're trying to encourage them to be with their friends or go out on a date to a movie or something like that. And Sydney mentioned alcohol. And honestly, I think that the future of theater, it seems to me, probably needs to include alcohol to create that vibe of we're going out, we're having a night out, we're going to go do something fun with our friends. How do you guys feel about that? And is that part of your model at all? I mean, even if it's like you go in, even if you don't bring it into the theater, if you like maybe have a bar there or nearby, where you can go see the movie, and then go to the bar and talk about it afterwards, that kind of thing, instead of, I don't know, how do you feel about that?
Well, we serve beer and wine, and it's a big part of our profit margin. Right. Not gonna lie. I also have a different demographic. Like if Sydney's got students, I would think twice before I want to offer them beer and wine, because you're gonna have some liability issues there. You look at Alamo Draft House and these other places that serve food and everything. You got to have a whole setup for that in a kitchen, and there's a lot of cleanup involved, I'm sure. Yeah. Beer and wine is a sweet spot, I think, because it's high profit. Most of the people that we're serving are not coming there to get drunk. They're coming to watch the movie and enjoy their alcohol while they watch it, and maybe that's enhancing their experience, but it's not the reason they're there. And I tell all my staff that too. I say, we're not a bar, so 3 drinks, that's it. You want to get drunk, you can go somewhere else. That's not what we're here for.
I think your idea is right, and there's a film scene in Iowa City just opened before the pandemic, and they actually have this Vino Veritas film series where they try and pair wine or a specialty cocktail with a film, which I think sounds, other than Bond, completely daunting. But their point also is, when I had to go to this film festival, movies are at dinner time. So I always have to make the decision, like, am I gonna eat before, eat after? But having a beer and a box of popcorn kind of graze the area a little bit, and then I'm like, oh, they serve beer there. And this film festival that I went to in North Carolina, that's what they did. They had food trucks and they had beer and wine. And I came back. My challenge, obviously, is at Dartmouth. I'm not sure how possible it's going to be, but my hope is that the bulk of our audience would just see it as a nice touch. And it is absolutely. We toured a bunch of theaters in Boston, the Coolidge and the Brattle, and they all said, really smart concessions will only add to your profits. I actually just saw Hannah Gatsby down in Boston, and if you don't think I didn't grab a cocktail and like terrifyingly overpriced caramel corn, but I was in there for 90 minutes and I was like, well, I'm just gonna have a drink and sit down, and it felt very adult, like on Broadway. And I do think movie theaters need to adapt and evolve, because we are competing on a different plane now for a smaller group of people. So I don't think it's a bad idea. Whether we have film clubs, they said AMC is now reaching out to some of their patrons and demographically saying, hey, you loved Belfast, look what we're playing next week. Something that most movie theaters have never done. They've just sat back, put the movie on the screen and waited for people to come. So I do think there's a lot of things that theaters can do to level the playing field with all the other options that are out for the evening.
Hi, I want to actually, AMC, what you just said dovetails with what I wanted to talk about or ask. We all know that when we go to AMC or Regal or a big chain, that we are spent a lot of time watching stuff before the movie, and we're getting hustled. We're being told how wonderful it is to go to the movies, but that's preaching to the choir. It's hustling the wrong people. We're already there. I live in New York, and so the big multiplexes have this wonderful sort of trickle-down thing because they make their bank with the big capes and masks, and then, in one of the smaller theaters down the hall, they'll have, something borderline art house, but that's in New York. I'm sure it's not that way everywhere. But why aren't the big chains advertising on TV or advertising in visible places as just the movies? This would then have this wonderful effect that that art houses and the Hop and other movie theaters that couldn't afford, say, a television commercial, the entire experience of going to the movies would be the product instead of Batman, Spider-Verse, I don't know, funny third thing. What do you guys think about that? I mean, should the large theaters play an active role and shoulder the burden of getting people back into theaters as the new hybrid world emerges?
I don't know what I think about that. I'd love it if they shouldered all the costs. I'd love it if they subsidized my theater.
Well, I think it would. I think I think it would have an effect.
Yeah, I don't know. I was putting together some retro trailers for our theater because there was a theater in San Francisco I loved called the Red Vic. Had their own homemade trailer. It never got old. They played it before every single movie. I laughed out loud every single time I saw it. And I'm not exaggerating. It was hilarious. It was like, it was funny and it was kitschy and it was their own thing. It was homegrown. So I wanted to do that for my theater. And so I was watching these old retro, exactly what you're talking about, let's all go to the movie, and this kind of stuff, and the hot dogs, the dancing hot dogs, and the drive-in theater, and they're really cool. But I think somebody's got to reimagine that, obviously, for today. Or what I did was I just took the old one, and so I play it before my films now, just as exactly what you're talking about, instead of this the movies are the greatest experience in AMC. I'm showing this 1940s promo for this theater in New York that's showing Psycho and stuff, and it's our version of it essentially. So.
Samantha, yeah.
I just have one thought on that about thinking about the Oscars as a kind of, indication of a industry-wide effort to promote movie-going, and watching the effort to change the Oscar format and figure out what it is that will push the right buttons for people to care about the movie theater. I mean, I think a lot of what we're talking about is nostalgia. It assumes that people sort of already have a relationship to theater going. Are we retiring that microphone? Yeah. But I think what you're proposing is a Got Milk campaign, a Got Movies campaign, movies in the theater. Yeah, so why don't you lead that, Jeremy? I think that's a great idea.
I think we have time for one more.
I've got one more, which is I wanted to say that I think a lot of this is, if you sort of pull back the lens to mix the metaphors, or go up to your 60,000-foot helicopter or your lotus blossom and just look that over time, I think one of you said this evolves. And I think what's, for me, very personally, the venue doesn't matter so much. So I was blown away by Nora's film about the poet in Vermont. And I watched that right here, and it was an incredible experience, and I'll never forget it. And it's 90-something% credit to her and some to this nice space. And, my kids and I, one of the best experiences I've ever had with my 3 boys was watching the Lego Movie at the Hop. It was transformative. Talk about a great story. I think that could be considered a big tent film, but it was an amazing story that was totally surprising to us, and I think the Dartmouth filmmakers were there at that night. And then on the train from New York yesterday, I was watching a 6-minute documentary about, I won't go into the whole thing, some Jewish guy in Australia in the 50s who moved a bunch of sheep to Israel. And it was a little 6-minute documentary from Australia on my thing on the Amtrak on my phone, and I was crying by the end. So I think we'll all, as a society, just kind of find our way to these stories. But I think theaters are I have no doubt they'll be around strong but waxing and waning for a long time. So that's.
Well, this is good. Well, we've heard a number of expressions of confidence in that theaters will continue to have an important part, an important role in our movie-going lives. I think the most important thing is that our movie-going lives stay going, because movies are still such a really, really important. I mean, they've morphed, and now we have all these multi-hour series on Netflix and all this kind of stuff. Some of
It's back to the story. Everyone wants to tell a story.
Yeah, exactly. It comes back to, right, that model again, the story around the campfire. Or I always think of some cave person, somehow coming up with a way to say things or show things that nobody has seen before, and everybody sits rapt and they're amazed. Anyway, I'm so glad that we've had it, and I feel so privileged to have been here with such a terrifically balanced panel, which WRIF has put together. We have a theater entrepreneur, sort of a specialty venue entrepreneur or programmer, and an actual filmmaker. And then a lowly critic to glue things together. So I feel very, very privileged to be here. I thank the three of you, and I thank all of you for being here so much.